It is Mr. Maycumber again, and I'm here to talk to you about the road to secession. We are inching closer to the Civil War, so as always, get ready to take some notes and think of questions that you might have as we go through this. First thing we need to understand is what secession means. Secession means to break away. In this case, we're talking about the South seceded from the Union, breaking away from the United States. What's actually interesting about that phrase is that the North was actually the first one to actually consider secession. During the War of 1812, the Northerners in New England met at the Hartford Convention and they thought about breaking away because they were very unhappy with the amount of taxes that were happening, especially for exporting goods. So it's interesting that the North was actually first interested in secession, but it was the South that actually did it once Abe Lincoln was elected president. So make sure you understand that word secede and secession as we go through this. Now we need to understand that slavery is basically the elephant in the room. And what I mean by that is that it has always been a big problem, but they haven't always talked about it. Okay, the founding fathers were very aware that slavery was going to be an issue, but they pushed it off because they were trying to create a government. They knew if they brought up slavery in 1787 that the country probably wouldn't be united. If they tried to get rid of it, then the South certainly would not have agreed to the Constitution. So what they did was they made certain ideas happen at the Constitutional Convention. The first major idea is called the Three-Fifths Compromise. Now, what this means is that slaves would count as three-fifths of a person when they're trying to figure out how many representatives a state could get. Now, remember, when we talked about the Congress, every state gets 2 senators, but the amount of representatives is based on the population. So obviously the South wanted slaves to count as a whole person so they can get more power in Congress. The North said, no way, you don't treat these people like real people. You don't treat slaves like real people, so therefore they shouldn't count at all. So they ended up counting them as three-fifths to allow for that compromise and make sure that nobody was angry. Now, really important here, when we say they count as three-fifths of a person, this gives no slaves any voting rights, any rights at all. This gives them no representation in Congress. This is just solely to count them to figure out how many representatives each state gets, okay? So I don't want you to think that slaves get any power based off of this. The second major idea to come from the Constitutional Convention is that no one is going to talk about banning the slave trade until 1808. Okay, they said this is such a controversial issue that basically nobody can talk about doing this. Even nobody can even talk about getting rid of the slave trade until 1808. For 20 years, no one can talk about doing this. So the slave trade exists in the United States until 1808. It is one of the last civilized countries to have a slave trade, African slave trade. Countries like England had already banned the slave trade before the United States. So kind of interesting. These are the founding fathers, a very famous portrait here. And what does George Washington have to say? George Washington, you know, he created a government, he helped create the government, but he does not want to deal with slavery. So this becomes a growing problem, mostly because of manifest destiny expansion. We've talked about this already. As the country expands, you have the issue of, do we expand slavery? And if we do expand slavery, it's going to be harder and harder to get rid of it because it's growing and growing and growing. This creates a bigger problem when it comes to sectionalism. Remember, sectionalism is a devotion to a part of the country. So you are more loyal to a part of the country. Okay? So the difference between the North and South become bigger and bigger and bigger as the issue of slavery comes up more and more. Because remember, the South is very, very dependent on slavery. They need slave. Cotton is king down south. The North really doesn't need slavery. Even though they do take the cotton and put it in their factories, they really don't need slavery to survive. The South does. The other major issue here is that neither side wants the other to have an advantage in Congress. Okay? If you add new states, that means you add new senators and you add new representatives. Neither side wanted the other side to have an advantage. So if you had more slave states than non-slave states, the non-slave states were very concerned that the slave states would make laws that would make slavery permanent. The same true is the other way. If you had more non-slave states, the slave states were going to be upset because they thought the non-slave states were trying to get rid of slavery, and they were to a lot of extent. So neither one really wanted to get the other one to have an advantage. This leads to Missouri causing a problem. In 1820, there were 11 free states and 11 slave states. This is perfect. There's a balance. Nobody has a clear advantage in Congress. There's an equal amount of senators, and there's an unequal amount of representatives, but it's okay because you have to go through both houses in Congress to make a law. When Missouri applies for statehood, it wants to be a slave state. This is going to be a problem because that would upset the balance in Congress. So the solution to come out of it is something called the Missouri Compromise. Henry Clay plays a huge role in this. He's the great debater here. He comes up with the proper way of dealing with this, and he says that Missouri will be a slave state, Maine would be a free state, and there'd be no slavery north of the 3630 line. That 3630 line was meant to prevent any future issues. So now you actually have a line that's going to tell whether it's going to have slavery or not slavery. So there's our friend Henry Clay, and he thinks, yes, he has solved the pesky problem of slavery. We shall see, Henry Clay. This map gives us an idea of what the Missouri Compromise looks like. Again, I really want you to spend a special amount of attention on this idea of sectionalism. I mean, look at the clear difference in our country. The northern side does not want slavery. The southern side does want slavery. I also want you to pay attention that the 3630 line, that red line there, Missouri is above that line. So basically, they made a rule and automatically broke it. And as you guys know, if you break the rule once, you're probably going to break it again. So this was a very temporary solution, Henry Clay. More problems arise as we get further into Manifest Destiny and further into expansion. You add Texas, you add the Mexican cession lands, and now all of a sudden you have the rise of popular sovereignty. And basically the popular sovereignty means is that you have the right to decide if you want to be slave or free. So you get to vote. The states get to vote now. Do you want to be slave states or free states? California applies for statehood in 1849, and the state wants to be free. The 3630 line, of course, runs right through the giant state, so you have the big issue of, do you split the state in half? What do you do as far as that 3630 line? So more problems show up, and Henry Clay is not very happy because apparently he did not solve the problem of slavery. Phooey. So what do we got here?
Guess who's back? Back again.
Henry Clay.
Back. Tell a friend. Guess who's back? 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 Guess who's back?
Yes, it's the return of Henry Clay. Henry Clay is going to work with Stephen Douglas to create the Compromise of 1850. California, in this compromise, California becomes a free state. The territories of New Mexico and Utah get to decide if they want to be slave or not because of popular sovereignty. They end up choosing slave. And the big part of this is that they strengthen the fugitive slave law. Basically, the fugitive slave law says that if you were caught helping a runaway slave, you were going to get in very much trouble. Therefore, you have to return all runaway slaves. This really upsets the Northerners because they don't want any part in slavery. They don't want to help it in any single way. They don't like the idea of strengthening the fugitive slave law. What's kind of interesting here as well, when a slave went in front of a court to decide if it was a free or not free, the judges actually got more money to say that the slave was a slave, was not free, than they did if they said he was free. So judges were obviously very biased here because they got more money to send the slave back to the South. So the legal system was very corrupt, which is why the Northerners were so angry. President Millard Fillmore said, hey, this is the final settlement. We did it. We solved everything. Much like Henry Clay, he was wrong. The Compromise of 1850 just puts a Band-Aid on things as things continue to grow bigger and bigger and bigger and the issues become larger. Here's the idea of what the country looks like in 1850. Again, notice the sectional divide here. The North and South are very different. Two different colors, clear as day as far as what it looks like. You can also see that there's some unorganized territory, meaning that more states are going to come in. And when more states come in, you're going to have those issues again about, upsetting the balance in Congress. So this issue is far from over. We're going to step away from the idea of Congress and stuff like that. We're going to talk about Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet Beecher Stowe writes a book in 1850 called Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it's a book about the horrors of slavery. Basically, the story talks about how slaves are forced to be separated, and the families are torn apart, and basically all the terrible things that happen regarding slavery. The book is a huge hit in the North. It actually sells 300,000 copies in its first year. Southerners hate it. They don't like this idea of people reading what's going on. The Northerners, many of them, never even knew what was going on until they read this book, and it really helps create more abolitionists, people that want to get rid of slavery, and a lot more anti-slavery feelings. Lincoln later comes up and says, "You are the little lady that started this great war," to Harriet Beecher Stowe. Okay, and Harriet Beecher Stowe down there says, "I did what?" And I say, "Grandma, you started a war." "I started a door?" "No, Grandma, you started a war." This gives you an idea of what Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is a picture of an advertisement for it. 2 million in a decade. 2 million books sold in a decade. So you can see how important this book was. Definitely spreads around and definitely gets a lot of people thinking about slavery. Popular sovereignty in action. So popular sovereignty after 1850 becomes a bigger trend. More people want to use popular sovereignty to try to decide if they should be slave or free. Kansas and Nebraska want to become official territories in 1854, and the Congress is going to allow them to do so because they want to make a railroad there, and there has to be an official government to make a railroad through the territories. The territories decide that they're going to use popular sovereignty. They're not going to listen to the Missouri Compromise. They're not going to listen to that line. So this is fine because popular sovereignty obviously gives the power to the people. The problem, however, is that on the day Nebraska is supposed to vote, thousands of armed Southerners go into the state to vote. So Southerners and Northerners as well, actually, are the ones that are casting ballots here, not the actual people of Nebraska. So only half of the ballots that were cast on that first election day were registered voters, and slavery won the election. They actually hold 2 elections, but the second election isn't any better. There's actually more voter fraud the second time around. So popular sovereignty creates this big issue of who's actually legally allowed to vote in the state. And this one is not on Henry Clay. Henry Clay was not around for this one. This was on Stephen Douglas. Does not help things. Actually makes a lot of problems, including a lot of violence. So Douglas, get it together. This all leads to something called Bleeding Kansas. And Kansas really becomes a big battleground. Basically, you have a pro-slavery government that creates several bogus laws. And these are laws that are basically meant to prevent slavery from going away. So the laws are going away. So some of the laws were that you could not speak against slaveholders. You cannot speak badly against slaveholders. And if you were caught helping fugitive slaves, then you could actually be put to death or sent to do manual labor for like 10 years. So there's actually some really harsh punishments related to these bogus laws. The abolitionists, who again are the people that want to get rid of slavery, they are so upset by this whole thing that they created a second government in Kansas. So there's actually 2 different governments in Kansas operating. President Franklin Pierce, the only president from New Hampshire, only recognizes the pro-slavery government, though, even though there are 2 governments. Kansas, again, a battleground. There's fires, there's kidnappings, there's murders, there's all types of problems here. And during the course of 7 years or so, 200 people die. Okay? So 200 people die in a period called Bleeding Kansas. So Kansas was not a very good place to live during this period from 1854 to 1861 or so. Okay? So Bleeding Kansas. This gives you an idea of what the Kansas-Nebraska Act looks like. A couple things I want you to pay attention to. The Missouri Compromise is basically null and void. That 3630 line does not matter because now slavery has expanded into the North a little bit. I also want you to pay attention to the Mason and Dixon line. That line helps separate the North and the South and becomes a very iconic line. It's not a real line, obviously, but it's a drawn line that shows the separation between the two regions. I also want to show you this map as well. You can see that Missouri and Kansas are obviously very close together. If you look on the right-hand side, you can see where free state people from free states attacked people that were pro-slavery, and people that were pro-slavery attacked people from slave states. So you can see a lot of fighting that's going on here. The people that crossed the border were called ruffians, and you can see down below some pictures of what those ruffians look like. Violence spreads into the Congress floor on May 22nd, 1856. Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts gives a big speech about the evils of slavery. He named some people and said, these guys are really bad. These guys are the people in charge of spreading slavery. Preston Brooks, who is a representative from South Carolina, he's not one of the guys actually named, but he gets very upset by the speech. He does not like the speech. He goes on the Senate floor and starts to cane Sumner. So here we go, two people from Congress that are supposed to be civilized, people that use their words and not their fists. And Preston Brooks is actually beating Sumner over the head with a cane while his friend holds a gun saying, let these guys talk it out, leave these guys alone. So you see that violence is huge, and this issue of slavery is not going to be solved peacefully, not going to be solved by laws. It's going to be something much, much more. Okay, this becomes very iconic. Obviously, Brooks gets kicked out of Congress for what he did, but people in South Carolina send him like golden canes and send him gifts saying, do it again, do it again. So very interesting what happens. Sumner has to go to the hospital for quite a while, but eventually goes back to Congress and serves for much longer, about 18 years, I believe. The next thing we look at is the Dred Scott case. This is a legal case about what a slave is in our country. And Dred Scott is a slave who belongs to an army officer. Scott lived in two states, free states, for several years. So he is a slave who lives with an army officer in free states for many years. Never really cares about it. Never really shows much anger about living in a free state and being a slave. And actually at one point he travels by himself across several free states back into the South in order to get to his master. So he really didn't care. He could have easily ran away at that time, but he didn't mind being a slave. When his owner dies, Scott is sold to someone else, and he decides that he wants to sue for his freedom. So he decides that he no longer wants to be a slave. He's going to sue. The court case takes 10 years before it eventually gets to the Supreme Court. And what's interesting during this whole entire time is that the people that are funding Dred Scott's court case are actually the army officers' sons. So they actually want Dred Scott to become free, so they are giving money to Dred Scott to make sure that he can pay for all the legal stuff. So after 10 years, it eventually gets to the Supreme Court. When he gets to the Supreme Court, Dred Scott really doesn't have a fair case, and the big reason why is because there are 9 Supreme Court members, and 7 of them were appointed by pro-slavery Southern presidents, meaning that they are very likely, and they are pro-slavery. Also, 5 of them were from slave-holding families. So these are not going to be people that are going to really listen to Dred Scott. And the final ruling shows that. In a 7-2 decision, the Supreme Court says that African Americans, including Dred Scott, are not citizens. No African American are citizens, and therefore they have no right to sue. So slaves are property. Okay? Slaves are nothing more than property. They are not citizens. They have no rights. They have the same amount of rights as like dogs and things like that. This makes Northerners furious. Okay? They are very upset by this ruling, and this helps lead to the rise of Abraham Lincoln. And he eventually becomes the Republican nominee in the 1860 election. Now, Lincoln is kind of an interesting character. You've learned a lot about Lincoln. Self-taught. He's a guy that worked very, very hard. He basically first becomes a national figure in 1858 when he faces Stephen Douglas, who we mentioned already. for a Senate seat. So this is an Illinois Senate seat. The two are battling each other. They debate all around the state about the issue of slavery. Douglas believes in popular sovereignty, saying that the people should choose. It should not be up to the government itself. Let the people decide. They will make the right choice. Lincoln says, no, no, no. Let's get rid of slavery completely. The two men are very interested because Douglas is very powerful, and he's a very good speaker, and he's very, intimidating as a figure. Meanwhile, Lincoln is tall, he's lanky, he has a really high-pitched voice. He does not look like a very confident man. In the end, Douglas ends up winning the election. He ends up being the senator, but Lincoln becomes very well known, and that helps him ahead of the 1860 presidential election. So here we go. Here's Abe Lincoln being a little too cocky, saying that he's going to go to Washington, D.C. We'll find out exactly what happens soon, I believe.
But first, let me take a selfie.
Yeah, I don't know what this is. I found this, so I guess enjoy it. So in the 1860 election, there are four major candidates for the presidency. There's a Northern Democrat, a Southern Democrat, a Constitutional Union Party member, and there's a Republican. Okay? There's a clear divide about what this country wants to do. As a result, Abe Lincoln is able to win the election, even though he doesn't go to any southern states, and even though he's not on many southern borders. This again shows that deep sectionalism, that Abraham Lincoln is able to win the presidency without a whole region's support. The North, part of the big reason why is because the North has a huge population, so there's more electoral votes in the North. When we look at the election map here, again, you can see that Abraham Lincoln grabs most of the northern states, also those western states that don't believe in slavery. He wins with 180 electoral votes, and the cartoon down below is a very famous cartoon that basically shows how this country is divided up. And you can see that this country is falling apart, it's ripping apart. Those band-aids that were put on earlier just simply aren't working. The South makes a big decision now. They say that Lincoln is not their president. They believe that he will not support them, that he is going to get rid of slavery. Even though Abe Lincoln says, and he's not even president yet, even though he says that he is going to leave slavery alone, the South does not believe this. And on December 20th, 1860, South Carolina becomes the very first state to secede. By February 1861, 7 states have broken away, seceded, and created the Confederate States of America. So now we officially have 2 different countries in North America. Jefferson Davis is elected the first and only Confederate States of America president. He is a senator from Mississippi who obviously resigns to become the president of the Confederacy. They start to create a constitution. They start to create their own government. They basically say that we do not want to be a part of the Union anymore. We do not want to be a part of the United States. The South basically says their big reason for breaking away is states' rights. They believe that the national government has become far too strong. They believe that the states have no power, that the individual states should be allowed to decide if they want slavery or not. They say that the Constitution basically gives them the power to break away if the government is being destructive. It's very similar, actually, to the Declaration of Independence. If you remember, it becomes necessary to break away. They believe that this has reached a time that they want to break away, and they just want to be left alone. They do not want to be taking over the North. They just want to be left alone, and they want to be their own country from here on out. James Buchanan is the president during this time, and he does nothing. He just says, you're not allowed to do that, but I don't know what I can do as president. So, James, yeah, you're a bad president. Finally, this is what the United States looks like as far as the South goes after secession. I want to point out a couple things. We haven't talked about Fort Sumner yet. We will very soon. Obviously, Fort Sumner creates a different dynamic in the South, but I also want you to notice that there are border states. So there are some states that allow slavery that stay a part of the Union during the war. So not all states that allowed slavery broke away during the war. We'll continue to talk about this in the coming days. Until then, goodbye.